This is Smarter Cities with me, Jason D'Souza. Every day, new incidents of data breaches are reported in the news, with some high-profile cases recently causing significant corporate and government disruption. But what do data breaches really mean? How do you defend against them? Well, joining me to discuss this is privacy and information governance expert Tim D'Souza. Tim D'Souza, welcome to Smarter Cities.
Very happy to be here.
Now, it's interesting to have you here, and we're thrilled to have you here. When Lily and Erin, our producers, and I were thinking about how to address this topic, we're thinking, well, we need an expert in this field. Who could this be? And we're looking up on Google. I thought, hang on, does my younger brother do this stuff? And so we thought it would be great to have you on. So I feel somewhat odd interviewing you, but it's great to have you here.
This is definitely a first. But on the other hand, it means I got to see your presentation voice in in person, and that was quite entertaining for me.
Well, I can imagine. So look, lots to talk about, so much in this space, and I will be the first to confess I know very little about it other than reading things in the newspaper. But it causes so much disruption in the community that I think is a really important issue. But before we get into it, I've never actually asked you this question, but how did you end up becoming an expert in this field?
Largely by accident, as is the case for many privacy experts. I started out as a lawyer. I went to law school. I went into private practice law and ended up as a planning and environment lawyer, which was great up until about 2009, when the GFC hit and people weren't building buildings because they couldn't get financing. And so as a consequence, they didn't need planning and environment lawyers anymore. So I suddenly found myself in need of something else to do. And at the time, the privacy commissioner was looking for people, and I interviewed and they gave me a job. And I went in, and on the first day they said, great, it's your first day as a privacy advisor. Here is the draft legislation, please edit it. So it was something of a trial by fire.
I love civil service. It's just extraordinary, isn't it?
Well, look, they were looking for lawyers with administrative law experience, and at that point, there weren't a lot of privacy experts. It wasn't a huge area. It was a small, fairly trivial, fairly poorly funded area of compliance. It was quite mature. The Privacy Act has been around since 1988, but in 1988 it was around the handling of physical documents. And when I joined the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, as it was then, they were in a transitional period and updating the Act to be more suitable for a modern, digitally enabled economy. So there was a lot of change happening, and they were needing to grow very fast. And that's the point at which I joined. And so I became an expert by practice rather than by training. Because at that time, in 2009, there was no formal training.
Was there an information commissioner at that time?
The information commissioner came along in 2010, if I remember correctly. Right. So the Office of the Privacy Commissioner was built out into the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner.
Oh, I see.
And so then there was an information commissioner, a privacy commissioner, and an FTI commissioner, and it was a blended agency with a fairly broad regulatory remit.
So that's a good segue. Then, from your history, you've now kind of got into this information space. Actually, just as an aside, I remember the whole reform period, moving from what was generally privacy to an information commissioner world. And each particular government at that time was establishing its own information commissioner, Office of Information Commissioner, because there increasingly was this demand at that time for information. And a lot of it was around transparency, wasn't it? It was less about sort of data security, but it was more about transparency.
Yeah, I mean, that period was around creating a single set of holistic principles that would cover both the private and the public sector. Prior to that, you had a separate set of privacy principles for government agencies and a different one for private sector businesses, and it was inefficient. So the process of amending the Privacy Act from 2010 to 2014 was around creating this single set of rules for everybody. But only for government agencies, only for federal government agencies, not for state government agencies. So then as you say, the state governments all had to implement their own version to just cover state government agencies. But across Australia, private sector businesses are covered by the Federal Privacy Act. But yeah, it was about bringing the Act up to date, because technology moves along quickly, and every so often when we are talking about how we regulate technology, we need to update the laws. Even though most technology laws, most information governance laws are principles based. So they're focused on objectives rather than particular techniques or particular technologies. So when we talk about the privacy principles, we're talking about, well, you have to keep personal information secure. Not, we're going to say you need to do these following 5 things to do that. The technology moves along too quickly for us to regulate in any sort of prescriptive fashion. So we go about doing that by providing prescriptive guidance or providing cybersecurity standards, that kind of thing. But that's the way with the regulation of a lot of technology.
Well, you sound like a civil servant, but you're actually not one, are you?
Well, you put me in the mind of the 5 years that I spent at the OAIC being a regulator. So what I did while I was there was move across a number of different industry sectors, from law enforcement to communications to ultimately technology regulation specifically. So things like social media, telecommunications, internet-based companies, and becoming the technology advisor in a de facto sense to the commissioner, because somebody had to be tracking the way that technology was evolving and what that meant for how we were going to regulate at that time. And then after that, I did a couple of stints in the private sector, so across CBA, Westpac, and then within the New South Wales government before landing where I am now, which is FTI Consulting, leading their Australian privacy and information governance practice.
Yeah, and have been very busy ever since, by the sounds of things.
Yes,
which is good.
because as you say, we're in a period in which there are increasingly severe data breaches and cybersecurity threats, and as a result, we're seeing a lot of personal information being stolen, put out into the public forum, and I think we've reached a point now where it's very much in the public consciousness. There's a lot of public anxiety about these continuing cyber attacks and what it means for people, and that's really shifted the conversation and shifted public awareness to a place where it hasn't been before.
So I think that's a great point, which I really want to delve into. But I think it would be useful for this conversation to actually define what privacy and information governance actually is. So,
Sure.
Organizations obviously have policies around these things. Here at Lend-Lease, we've got plenty of these sorts of things. It's become increasingly more important. We have a lot of government clients here as well, and they have certain requirements of us that require us to protect information and data, in particular when we're working with them. But what does it actually mean? How do you define it?
Sure. So in a regulatory sense, privacy and privacy regulation is about how you handle personal information. That is, information about people, individuals, not companies, not corporate entities.
So you're a phone company or something, and you've got millions of customers.
Correct.
They give you their credit card data, their license data, whatever,
Yeah.
and that needs to be protected.
Correct.
That.
At every point of what we call the personal information life cycle. So from the point where you collect or create the data to how you store and secure it, how you use or disclose it, and then towards the end of life, how you make decisions about whether to archive it, destroy it, or de-identify it. So at every point in that life cycle, you have obligations under the Privacy Act in Australia or under other personal information handling legislation in other jurisdictions. And that can intersect with other record-keeping requirements like requirements from the ATO to keep financial records, and so to speak. So some of the data you handle as an organization is personal information, but not all of the data. A lot of the data you handle is about corporate operations or what have you.
Yeah, which is where I was going to ask. So firms like healthcare providers, FMCG sort of people who have B2C businesses, get it, lots of personal information, whatever. But corporations that don't do B2C and more B2B, are you saying there that it's more about corporate to corporate data protection,
Well, and that's
industrial espionage sort of thing.
Well, that's where we get to information governance. So information governance is a broader discipline than privacy alone. It's about how you handle all of the data that your company holds or your organization holds. And that's going to be things like corporate contracts for all of your suppliers. It's going to be things like the amount of data that your smart building is creating as people come in and out of it and move through it. So the energy levels that you're monitoring across different floors. Everything that you're creating, and because we live in 2023, every business, every organization is a data-driven business. So every day we create more and more data, and that has to be managed. Because if it isn't, it's going to create a risk. Quite apart from that, you're storing a lot of data. And while people like to make claims about, storage is cheap and information wants to be free and what have you, storage is cheap, but it's not free.
Information wants to be free. This is a new term of freedom of information.
Well, that's more from like the early 2000s when...
Free the information.
Well, I mean, that was a catch cry of the early 2000s.
No.
When things like Napster was big. Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah, information wants to be free. The idea being that digital data is easy to copy, easy to transfer, easy to send. Why are we restricting access to this stuff? It's a little utopian.
Wow. Yeah.
But there's a valid point there. We are creating a huge amount of data because it's easy to create and it's easy to store. And what that means is we can wind up with massive hordes of data. And we might be holding on to it just in case it's useful. But that doesn't mean it is. We have to have some insight into what that data is in order to leverage it. And what we often find is that companies are holding on to huge chunks of data with very little idea of what's in there. You can have a data warehouse, it can be filled with useful stuff, but if you can't find that useful stuff, it's not useful to you anymore. So that's what information governance is about. It's about structuring and organizing that data in a way that it can be used, and also thereby helping yourself work out what you need and what you don't need, and putting yourself in a position where you can eliminate what you don't need, because that's going to save you money because you're not paying for the storage of it, but it's also going to reduce your risk because you can't lose what you don't have. And this is a problem that we're finding in a lot of these data breaches right now. We're seeing these huge hacks happen from organized criminal gangs who make their way into corporate networks, find a lot of data, and steal it. And the effects of those breaches are made worse by the fact that a lot of that data did not need to be held. So we're routinely seeing data breaches where people are like, oh, well, we've lost 4 million customer records. And those customer records date back 12 years.
And they might not even be relevant anymore.
Exactly. So if they're not relevant, why are we holding them? Also, if you didn't have a specific obligation to hold that data, why are you holding it? Yeah. And if you didn't have a business need to hold that data, then why were you holding it?
So the thing I find interesting with that, right, is so you've got these corporations, they've got lots of data. Everyone's holding lots and lots of data. Think of your own personal circumstances. Like I must have, and my great friend Harvey Wharton, who's the CIO here, says, people have a file and they'll have it in 8 different places.
Yep.
The same file, right? And of course the corporation has to store all of that, right? So, just me, I know I've got the same file in multiple places for different reasons.
Final 1, final 2.
Well, it could be
really
final
this time.
Yeah, it could be that, or it could be, this particular document is relevant to this particular project, but it could also be relevant to that particular project, so it goes into that project file. Right, and so on and so forth. So you've got all this data. First, I take the point on cost of storage. I think that's right. But the thing that frightens me more is what you mentioned earlier, which is the sort of corporate hostage taking. So you've got this quite a few examples now of these sort of firms. I think there's one that's got a name. I can't remember what its name is, but it basically takes your system hostage. And then they sort of demand a payment to give you the advice on how to release yourself from the system. Right?
So what you're talking about is ransomware.
Yes.
And ransomware is a particular kind of attack. One that we've seen quite a lot lately from organized criminal gangs, often Russian, but not necessarily only Russian. So we also see similar gangs out of China, out of North Korea. There are a few.
Out of North
ones.
Korea?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Wow.
They can't afford to feed their people, but they can run a ransomware.
Well, ransomware is very profitable.
Yeah, quite.
And you generally find these gangs in places where governments are going to allow them to operate.
Yeah, yeah.
So a lot of these gangs have identities. They will have corporate branding. So, for example, Revil, Clop, Darkwave, they have names, and they basically name themselves, or they are named by the market after the name of the ransomware solution that they're using. So we should probably talk about what ransomware is.
Yeah, so define what it is.
Yeah. So the idea is you're a hacker, you find a way into a network. So I've made my way past your firewall, I'm now inside your network. I'm going to deploy some software. And what the software will do is encrypt all of your systems. I, the threat actor, will hold the encryption key. You, the victim, will have no way of decrypting the data, so you can't access your systems. I will then say, hi, I've ransomwared your entire system. You can give me a bunch of money, and I will unlock it. And
I will
you can
give
get
you
back.
advice on how to deal with the data security breach that you've got.
Well, that's more of a scam, and I think they're more bold and direct these days. So what they're saying is, we have locked your system. You will not be able to get into this system unless we give you the encryption key. And we won't do that unless you give us this much money. Generally in a cryptocurrency like Bitcoin or what have you. So that's the first stage of the ransom, right? We're holding your data ransom, pay us or you won't get it back. We have taken your system hostage. Now, you might choose to pay that, or you might choose to restore your system from a backup. If you have a backup, which many victims don't. But also, there's a second layer to the extortion, because they'll go, well, we've also stolen all your data. We haven't just locked your systems. Before we did that, we took all your data out and we have a copy of it now. So pay us or we're going to publish that online and it will be open season on you.
Wasn't there a case recently where the victim said, go ahead, publish it?
Yeah, and that is not uncommon, because if you have a good backup, you can just restore your systems from the backup and not worry about having to pay the ransom for your data, but you can't stop them from publishing the data.
So you're a company, you say, all right, go ahead, publish my data.
And we'll deal with the fallout.
And we'll deal with the fallout. So, for example, if you're somebody who deals with customers, all their data is out there. So as a company, surely that's bad, right?
Well, yes, and for the customers, it's also bad because they're now at a heightened risk of identity theft. They're not just publishing this stuff on the open web, they're publishing it in dark web forums, which are frequented by criminals who will take that data and use it against your customers. That's what they're holding to ransom, the safety of your customers, not just the public exposure. The third level of the extortion is we're actually going to directly contact your customers and tell them that you don't care about their security because you won't pay this ransom, that you don't care about their safety, and that they should contact you and ask you why. So they're going to burn your customer base, your customer is going to be upset, and they're going to go to a competitor.
And then the ransomware company then goes and attacks the competitor.
Yeah, maybe so. They're looking for...
We're in the wrong business.
Well, I mean, there was one gang I was looking at in 2021, Revil. They took $80 million in 2021 that we know of. And data breach reporting is partial. A lot of people will not report if they don't have to or if they can avoid it, because it's embarrassing to the company. So no one wants to admit that they've paid a Russian ransomware gang $5 million when they should have been doing a better job on keeping their system secure.
So when do you get called in? Do you get called in after an attack has happened, or do you get called in before an attack has happened, or how does it work?
So both, and the balance is shifting. It used to be that we would be called in when an attack had happened, and then we would assist them to move through the attack, and then after that, it would be very easy to get internal funding to improve systems.
But what does help somebody through an attack mean?
So attacks can take weeks, or at least the process of responding to an attack can take weeks.
So I've attacked you. I've locked down your system.
As you frequently do.
Yes, quite true. So I've attacked you. I've taken all your data. I've locked down your system. You're now involved. What's the process?
So let's say we've been called in because somebody's experienced an attack. Great. The first stage would be we'll bring in the cybersecurity team and they will try and resecure the perimeter. So they will try and find out whether the attacker is still within the network. If so, kick them out. And then fix whatever vulnerability that allowed them to get in so they can't get back in. That way, at least we know that they're not watching everything that we do. Then we'll try and work out what was stolen, so how much data was exfiltrated, and we'll conduct a risk assessment around that data. And that can be quite difficult, because if they've stolen many gigabytes or terabytes of data, there could be a huge amount of personal information in there, like hundreds of thousands of affected customers. And we need to know who those people are. We need to know how much data about each of them has been stolen, so we can work out who is most at risk and what we can do to protect them. And then we'll also be dealing with the ransom demands themselves. So do we need to pay? Can we restore from backup? If we don't pay, what is the fallout going to be for the customers? And then there's the regulatory lens, because there are data breach reporting requirements in many jurisdictions. So do we have to notify the Australian regulator? Do we have to notify European regulators or regulators in Southeast Asia?
Because many of these firms would be international in nature.
Exactly.
Right? So then there's multiple regulatory.
Yeah, and the
interfaces.
regulatory regimes are all different. The notification timelines are all different. So in Europe, you have to notify regulators within 72 hours. In Australia, you have up to 30 days. And none of the timeframes quite
Right.
approach. Then you also have the intersection of sector-specific regulation. So say you're in financial services, then APRA's got notification requirements. You might need to notify ASIC as well. Those timelines don't match up. There's also critical infrastructure notifications, SOCI, that require you to notify under them as well. And none of those timelines are harmonized. So there's a fairly complex process by which you work out what the risk is and who you have to tell and when you have to tell them. So we'll assist on that as well.
So that sounds intense. Right?
It can be, yeah.
One of the things I sort of was wondering is that these companies are the attacker is operating illegally.
Yep.
Somewhere. They must have breached some sort of law. But if they're operating in a jurisdiction you can't get to them in,
Which is
like
usually the case.
North Korea or Russia or something, is there an international law that covers them? That you can get them? I mean, you can't get them anyway.
You are welcome to ask the Russian government to do something about them, but
they won't.
you are likely to be stonewalled. So
Yeah.
I rarely see clients going down that route. And frankly, it is not the first thing on the agenda. The first thing on the agenda is to get the business operational again. And you can work out, retribution, if possible, later on down the track.
Yeah.
But it generally is very, very difficult. These people are professionals. They're good at what they do. And they have very good tactics for avoiding the law enforcement repercussions.
There have been some scary cases. Like there was a case I read somewhere there where the attacker took control of the building and took control of the lifts. So people were trapped inside these lifts.
Yep. Pretty
And
good way to get to encourage someone to pay you.
The doors were locked. The building was locked. The building was taken hostage. Right. And they wouldn't release the building until they were paid. Now, when you've got people sort of trapped in a building, you get paid pretty quickly, right?
Unless you have a better backup plan in place.
Well, you've got to release the building. So I just, the concept of a building being taken hostage, the only time I could think of a relevant one was the Nakatomi building back in Die Hard, where they took the whole building hostage, right? That was different.
If I'm not if I'm not mistaken, that was a 1988 movie. So way to stay relevant there.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I still love the fact that we spend Christmases watching that film. But anyway,
Look, it is tradition.
it's something
Tradition must be observed.
My wife just does not understand why we love doing that. But anyway, so that's interesting on the reactive side. So I get now there's a crisis, you get brought in, you fix it, everyone's happy, but are we sort of moving into a world where people are bringing you in beforehand saying, hey, protect me from this nightmare?
So that's always the position that we take with clients as to what they should be doing. Don't wait for the crisis to hit. Let's actively prepare for it now. So let's make sure that you've got good information governance in place. Let's go through the data minimization process and make sure that you are only holding what you need to hold so it can't be stolen from you.
I love this concept of reducing the amount of data being held, right? Because there's data everywhere, right?
There is, and it does get in the way, and people just have like massive stores of data that are kicking around that they've kept because they can keep it, and it's a lot of effort to understand what's in it and reduce it. But what we're seeing now, where the balance has shifted, is on the back of some of the big data breaches that we saw last year in Australia and the chaos that they've caused. There are more organizations that are more interested in being proactive, in setting up the governance, in doing the data remediation, in preparing the data breach response plans, and making sure that they've gone through a few simulations and know what they're going to do if a crisis hits them. The old adage is, it's not if you get hit, it's when. The idea that there are so many security threats now that it will happen to you at some point in some shape, way, or form. So you need to have a comprehensive security incident management plan, or privacy incident management plan, or overarching crisis management plan. You need people who are built into that plan, who have read it, who have understood it, who've been trained on it. And then you need the overarching governance, so you can prove to regulators, hey, we thought about this. We looked at where the risks are. We put in checks and balances and controls, because if and when the crisis hits, that's what they'll be looking for. Not only how did you handle the crisis, but what did you do to mitigate your risk before it hit? What did you do to reduce the severity of the incident or reduce the frequency of security incidents? So where the balance has shifted is, I think prior to last year, it's not controversial for me to say that, generally speaking, what we would see is clients would get hit and suddenly they had an interest in uplifting their controls.
I'm sure. Yeah.
Now we have clients who are coming to us who are interested in doing this proactively, not waiting until they get hit, and doing the work right now. And I think that's coming from an enhanced understanding of how bad this risk is from the senior executive of organizations and from the boards of organizations. And so they're getting boards coming to them proactively saying, what are we doing about cybersecurity risk? What are we doing about over-retention of data? We keep seeing all this stuff. It looks really bad. We don't want this to happen to us. And that's a really interesting shift. The kind of thing that privacy professionals have been saying for the last 10 years. One day they'll know. One day they'll understand, and they'll be proactive about this. They'll know that it's cheaper to do it proactively. They'll finally listen to us. We're at that point now where...
Oh, the poor privacy professionals.
The poor privacy professionals. We've been shouting about this risk for a decade. And now we're like, yes, we can be smug. We have form here. We have been saying this for a long time, and people are finally listening to us. It's a moment of great catharsis.
I still remember the what was it, the Privacy Awareness Week, which I always find amusing, which the slogan was "Keep it to yourself."
No, that didn't happen. And here's where we're back to fake news. That was the slogan that you proposed.
Oh,
Privacy,
I see. Sorry.
Keep it to yourself.
Keep it to yourself. Well, it made sense to me.
We did not go with that slogan, you will be unhappy to learn.
Let me take a step back to this hostage thing, because I think one of the things I find really interesting is this whole, we've just gone through this whole massive disruption in politics around election interference and Russians, and the Russians are coming, which, it's funny how these thematics keep coming up through history, right? And I think it's been the case that there's lots of attacks on elections from some of these actors, but in different ways, right? So, one case during the American elections was this whole Cambridge Analytica matter, which some people kind of understand. I don't really understand it, so I'm kind of keen to talk about that. And then the more sort of, disinformation type of, pumping out of data that is potentially false flag information. What are your thoughts on that? Let's start with Cambridge Analytica, because I think it's an interesting case.
It is an interesting case, but it's also a fairly old case at this point. So I will begin with technology is a tool. And the thing about tools is you have to use them correctly in order for it to be safe. And if you use tools incorrectly, you can cause a lot of damage. So if you're trying to bang in a nail, a hammer is great. If you're trying to put in a screw, a hammer is not going to be very helpful. You can try and bash it in, but you're more likely to slip and smash your own thumb. Ultimately, the street finds its own uses for things. So if you create a technology, you need to be conscious of how that technology could be used to harm people. And that's where I find we're at right now with things like misinformation and large language models and generative AI, but also with the way that we have constructed our society at present to be digitally mediated.
So sorry, just when we talk about large language models, we're talking about what people know as ChatGPT, correct?
ChatGPT is an example of a large language model.
Yeah.
Basically, we've taken a computer and we've said, well, we've taken a machine learning process and we've said, here are a bunch of examples of different kinds of writing. Can you statistically predict from a prompt what the next word in this sentence will be, and what the next sentence will be, and what the next paragraph will be? So there's no intention behind that. It is a statistical prediction of what should come next based on what has come next in the examples that it's seen. And we're talking
based
about
on
like,
everything that's in the internet before then, right? Basically.
well, based on a very large data set. It doesn't have to be the general internet. And the problem with training a large language model on the general internet is there's a lot of garbage on the general internet. You can train an LLM on a smaller, more curated data set and have different and arguably much better results. The risk is what we're training it on. And the risk is the weight that we assign to that. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up in the context of elections is one of the problems we're experiencing with elections in the last, say, 10 years is an increase in misinformation. The internet makes it very easy to say whatever you want. That's one of the great things about it. But when you say whatever you want, and you can distribute information so easily because information wants to be free, you can start saying false things. And those false things can run around the world in seconds. Now, it takes effort to create false narratives. But what if it didn't take effort? What if you could ask a large language model to create a fake news article and go to a generative AI system and ask it to create a picture or use a video system to create full motion video of a politician saying something that they didn't say? This is not an if scenario. It is possible now.
Oh, it's happening now.
And we're already starting to see it being used in politics. So recently we saw I believe it was the National Party in New Zealand, put out an ad campaign using generated images of Maori people to create the sensation, to create an ad campaign, a political advertising campaign using generated images. Now, many jurisdictions don't have a truth in political advertising law. We don't. So we could be using this kind of technology.
But what's the
here.
difference between that? I'm not aware of the case, but let's just use that as a context. What's the difference between that and using actors?
Well, that's a good question. At least the actors are real people. The question is the potential. You could theoretically create full motion video of a politician saying something and create a political ad around that. Now, if they didn't say that, that's going to be problematic, defamatory at the very least. But those kinds of legal remedies are not going to help you when you've already created the impression.
Too late, right? Yeah.
So,
but the thing is, the trouble I have with this debate is the political campaigning at its essence is one group putting forth a set of views and a set of points, and another group putting forward a set of views and a set of points.
which would be great, but what you can't do is misrepresent.
No, I agree, but at the same, so that's the positive part. This is my ideology. This is what I want to do. This is our plan, whatever. And then the other part of it is saying their plan is false or fails because of A, B, C, D, right? Some of that is blatantly untrue. It is that's just how it's always been in election campaigns, right? And it's up to each party to dispute that. That's part of the context of politics. So that's been the case in the analog world. I'm just going to use that phraseology, right? Analog world. So now that we're moving into this much faster digital, much more realistic digital world, what's the difference? And what classes something as misinformation?
The difference is if I can create misinformation in a matter of seconds, but you then have to go through a long and involved process where you counter all of my made-up nonsense with exhaustive research and structured arguments, that is not a scenario that you can win. I will just drown you in misinformation and you will not be able to keep up. And that is the problem that we're seeing in some jurisdictions around the way that misinformation works. QAnon in the US is a really good example of this.
Tell us about that.
It is it's interesting from a sociological perspective because it is not a conspiracy theory that is specifically being created by a group that is being propagated out there. It is a consensus conspiracy theory. There is a community of people that are building these various conspiracies together. And sure, there is an anonymous personality by the name of Q that is supposedly dropping information.
There is a personality named Q, really?
Yes.
Okay.
Hence QAnon. But that...
Oh, Q Anonymous.
Yes.
I see. Right.
But that person may not be a single person. It may be multiple people. And anybody can represent them to be Q because Q is anonymous. The creation of the various conspiracy theories...
Somebody's been watching Star Trek, have they? Is that the...
who can say? I believe the Q reference is specifically a claim about Q-level security clearance.
Okay.
The original claim was that Q was a high-level person within the U.S. government that knew all these secrets, and that's how they were able to disseminate them. There is, of course, no evidence of that. But these conspiracy theories are bizarre. They're bizarre and outlandish, and as a result, the way that I approach misinformation is not, well, this is a sophisticated political enterprise where, political candidates are misrepresenting their opponents. That's not the real threat. The real threat is just drowning people in absolute nonsense, knowing now that we have created a community that are willing to consume that absolute nonsense because there is so little trust in institutions.
I think that's the key, right? It's not so much the challenge of information from either side of an argument. It is the volume of stuff, that's constantly at you, constantly,
Yeah. So and this is where we bring it back to generative AI. We're already struggling with the volume of misinformation, and that misinformation is basically being handcrafted. What we now have is the potential to create that misinformation at volume and at speed, a velocity that we have never seen before. And having to counter that is going to be very, very difficult. So the challenge that we have as a society is when you can fake anything with ease and with a high level of fidelity, how do we trust anything that we see?
So what's the answer to that question?
I don't have one. But
I don't think anyone does right now.
Not yet. There are some solutions that are being considered, and one would be things like digital signatures. Is this video digitally signed so that you can link it back to the entity that produced it? So if you're putting out a news report on the internet and you're putting out video with that, there's a digital signature that can be expected that you could link back to the issuing agency. The question is, that's great for a professional outfit that's trying to verify the source.
Yeah.
How are individuals going to verify the source? How are individuals going to be able to make the distinction between what's actual video, actual reporting, actual photographs, and what's been faked? And that is an existential challenge to the way that we run our societies.
And then the other challenge is, where is that line between a particular position, which you may or may disagree with or agree with or whatever, and fake. So this is a huge thing.
Yeah.
People are saying, Donald Trump coined the phrase fake news, right? I mean, it's an interesting point. You could have, particularly in the US, you've got different media sources that take a particular political position. One side will say, well, that's fake news because that ideology is not, or that position is not what I agree with. The other side says, no, you're fake news because, that's the position I disagree with. In a free society, both should have the opportunity to convey those positions. The era of news being unbiased, I think, is gone, right? Or at least in the United States. I don't know about you.
In a free society, you should definitely have the opportunity to provide differing opinions, but you cannot lie. Free speech is not an unqualified right. Free speech in Western liberal democracies has always been bounded by law. You cannot go and shout fire in the crowded theater is the canonical example, because that is going to get people hurt. You can't lie about people because that's defamation. And defamation is the traditional solution to what you're talking about in terms of, well, where's the line between opinion and fake news? But that doesn't work with political and misinformation. it's too fast, and the impacts are too severe.
And the legal system takes too long to...
And whether or not it's defamatory, by the time you get round to getting to that outcome, the election's probably over.
Yeah, quite.
So I don't have solutions for this, and I don't think we've got good solutions.
What kind
to
of
this
consultant
yet.
are you? I mean, my God, aren't you supposed to provide solutions?
Well, I mean, if you'd like to pay me and go through a 3-year consulting project, I'm sure we could come up with solutions.
Yeah, there we go. But I think it's a really worrying time in that sense, because I think the whole system of government is under so much pressure now with all this stuff, and there are defamation proceedings on people tweeting things, for example, right? Anybody can be a news source today, and so they should be if they wish to be. But who is the arbiter of what is real and what isn't?
There's a much longer conversation about the settings of defamation law and when they're appropriate in modern day society.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean,
People say rubbish on Twitter. Well, probably 90% of it's probably nonsense. I don't know. Right?
look, there's quite a lot of
There's some good stuff on Twitter, obviously, or X, as it's called now.
But that is the internet. The internet gives everybody a megaphone, and there are some very positive points to that, and there can be some very negative points.
This show is a social media-based show. It's published on YouTube and LinkedIn. And
exactly. I mean,
right?
Nobody in their right mind would have given you a radio show in your own bed. So.
That's right. Thank you for that. Let's go a little bit to just a bit more on this AI stuff, because I think there was a really frightening case recently where a mother received a call from her daughter saying that she had been held hostage or whatever and demanded ransom. The child was at school, and her voice had been faked, right, using some form of AI.
Yep.
That is a terrifying scenario. Have you heard of that
Yes,
case?
I have heard of some similar things. Yeah, deepfakes of voices are getting very, very good very, very quickly. And in fact, on iOS 17, the Apple operating system, you'll be able to train Siri to speak in your own voice.
Oh, fantastic.
And all of that processing will be done on your own phone. So that's how ubiquitous the technology is going to become.
Why would you want Siri to speak in your own voice?
I'm really not sure where the demand for that particular feature is coming from. I just know that it's happening.
Yeah.
I absolutely despise hearing myself talk, all appearances to the contrary. But I can't imagine my phone talking to me in my own voice. That would be really, really bizarre. But the point is, the technology is going to be ubiquitous, and you'll be able to train it with minutes or, in some cases, seconds of training material. And people put their voices out on the internet all the time. Kids live their lives on social media. And a lot of that is full motion video these days with things like TikTok or Instagram Reels.
People are talking to their phones all the time.
Yeah, and people are publishing their voices all the time. So it wouldn't be difficult to get enough material to create a deep fake of a voice.
So
and with celebrities.
How do you defend against that?
Well, so it depends on who's being attacked. How do you defend against it when you're a parent? Is the question of how do you defend against scams in general, and that's understanding how those scams run and being aware of them. Obviously, if you're getting a call from your daughter but it's not coming from her phone number, that's going to be an interesting red flag. But some of the work I do is around teaching people how to recognize scams, and these scams change periodically. So a similar scam to the one that you're talking about is known as the Hello Mum scam. You get a message from an unknown number. It says, "Hello Mum, I've been traveling. I'm stuck in France. My wallet got stolen. I'm texting you from a friend's phone. Can you send me some money to this account?" And that doesn't work on everybody because not everybody's kids are traveling in France.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you send out 10,000 text messages, 2 of those people might have kids traveling in France. It's not about targeting in that context. It's about mass market approaches, hoping that you'll get 1 or 2 hits and then focusing on those 1 or 2 hits. Whereas the one that you're talking about is a very targeted spearfish. It is, we've done some research into you, we've got your daughter's name, we've got your daughter's voice.
We have this information, we're going after this particular wealthy family.
Exactly.
Who we know 50K is nothing for, and we'll just we'll attack them.
And people people panic if their kids are involved. That's a vulnerability that can
Yeah,
be
of course they
exploited.
do, right? Yeah, but of course, the flip side to that is, you know, hostage taking and that sort of scenario isn't new. I mean,
True.
it's done fairly regularly, right? It's just now there's a digital element to it.
Yeah.
And perhaps it's wider than, you know, previously known. And maybe we know more about it now because, of course, it's so easy to get information about things.
This is true. But the fact is that everybody in a digitally mediated society, and I keep using that phrase because everything we do is digital now, but there is so much more sensory input. You have hundreds of notifications a day from various apps or emails, phone calls, text messages. You go to work and you're bombarded with emails there. You come home and you're looking through social media, which is short, sharp messaging. It's a huge amount of sensory input, and that reduces your tendency to dig deeper into things. And so if you are surrounded by input and you get one that causes you to panic, you react quickly. And that is the tendency that's being exploited in these kinds of scams. So it is about raising awareness so that people can recognize a scam when they see it. And that's difficult to do because we're not dealing with a single block of people who are all alike. We're dealing with a broad spectrum of society who have different levels of familiarity with different technologies. So, for example, the elderly are often exposed to some pretty heinous scams. A common one that I come across quite a lot is the Microsoft support scam. So you call a random phone number and you say, "Hello, sir. Hello, madam. I'm calling you from Microsoft." Well-known brand. Everyone knows Microsoft. Most people are going to have a personal computer that has a Microsoft operating system. I'm calling you from Microsoft. We've detected that there's a virus on your computer. We're here to help you remove that from your computer. Will you open your system, go to this link, download this software. This will help us navigate to your computer.
And then it's ransomware, basically.
Well, it could be ransomware or it could be ID takeover, where they get you to put in your credit card details when they've downloaded software onto your system and you've given them access to your laptop so they can see what you're entering. Then they say, "Look, there's just a small payment so we can give you this service. Please enter your credit card details into this portal." They capture your credit card details and then they go off and
buy lots of stuff.
Indeed.
Yeah, right.
And that's incredibly common. And so if you call someone who's 35, they're probably going to go, "Come on, Microsoft doesn't call people like that."
Yeah.
And I'm not telling you anything. But if you're an 80-year-old that happens to be unfamiliar with computers and doesn't use your computer very much and thinks, "Oh, this is nice. Microsoft are calling me to help me deal with all of these viruses and all of these
problems
that I keep hearing about." Then that's very common.
Let me. It's a good segue to something that I've been thinking about a lot recently, which is sort of cashless society, right? So, it occurred to me the other day when Margaret showed me this thing you can do on your phone now, where you can just tap on automatically when you turn up at whatever, the tram or the train or whatever. You just hold your phone over, it clicks on, taps immediately. And I think it occurred to me that actually everywhere you go, you can now be tracked. Because cash you couldn't track, but so every trip you take, every time you park your car, every time you enter a building, every time you buy anything, every time you do anything. So now we're in a situation where basically you're always under some form of surveillance, right?
Yep.
Is this what George Orwell envisaged?
George Orwell definitely envisaged a surveillance society, and you are absolutely stretching me to the limit here because I haven't read 1984 in about 15 years. But he definitely envisaged pervasive surveillance. I don't think he envisaged the specific level of payment tracking or the digital device tracking that we can do now.
Well, there's CCTV everywhere.
Yes, and that's definitely more Orwellian than payment tracking.
You can track anyone, anywhere. You can find out what what their habits are. Siri listens to you all the time, so it will advertise
this is
whatever
true,
to you.
but
So,
okay, so
I'm being provocative.
I mean, you're not really, though. The thing is, yes, CCTV is quite pervasive. And from a law enforcement perspective, law enforcement would love if all the CCTV systems talk to each other and could enable more linked up tracking. That's kind of what they're trying to do, and there are various initiatives in place to try and make CCTV systems, which are often administered by local councils, link up with each other and then link up with other law enforcement systems like customs or AFP.
Right, so we're under total surveillance all the time, that
Yeah.
means, right?
The canonical example there is the London Ring of Steel. Their entire metro CCTV integrated system, which was largely prompted by things like terrorist and security attacks in that jurisdiction. But yes, CCTV can be quite pervasive, and it is possible to absolutely track people across different locations using CCTV,
but not just
and
using CCTV,
facial recognition.
using facial recognition,
Exactly.
using their tap on, tap off, using their bank account.
That's where it starts to become more difficult to do that kind of linking, because ultimately different people hold this data.
But how do we know a government can't compel an organisation to hand over?
They absolutely can. And this is where we get back to proportionality and where we come back to privacy in general. Privacy at its core, in terms of regulatory philosophy, is about control over how the information about you is handled. So who is allowed to handle your information, what are they allowed to do with it, and what rights do you as an individual have to assert control over it? So this is kind of where Australia is in terms of its regulatory journey here. We're at the point in the law reform process, which has been going on for about 3 years now, where we're about to amend the Act. And one of the things that we're amending the Act to do is to, according to the Attorney General's Department, is to provide more personal rights.
More personal rights.
Correct. Currently under the Act, you have the right to access the information that is held about you. You have the right to correct it if it is incorrect. In Europe, under the General Data Protection Regulation, you have many more rights. You have the right to explicitly withdraw consent for your information to be used for any purpose. You have the right to restrict processing. You have the right to demand that your information be destroyed, commonly known as the right to be forgotten. So we're looking at expanding our personal rights here to encompass some more of those rights.
The right to be forgotten. Hey?
The right to be forgotten. Because if I no longer use you as a supplier, you're not providing me with banking services, you shouldn't keep that information eternally. What would the possible need be for that? So after your 7 years that you are required to keep that information, I can come to you and say, please delete all that information about me. I do not intend to use your services again, and if I do, I'm happy starting fresh.
Mm. But I think there's a really interesting thing. I mean, there's two schools of thought, right? The first is, okay, fine. I use tap and go. I use all the stuff. I sign in to everything. I've got 9 million passwords. Everybody knows what I'm doing. But I've got nothing to hide anyway, right? I lead an ordinary life. I go to work. I have a family. I do stuff. So who cares? That's one school of thought. Fine. You've got all my information. Isn't it only criminals that want to hide things?
Do you have a door on your bathroom?
Yes.
Would you like to have a bathroom that didn't have a door?
Well, not particularly, no.
So wouldn't you say that there are some things that you would like to have privacy on?
But why would it be? Well, actually, I'll correct myself there. But yeah, okay. So, but that's a very physical example, right? I mean, there's no reason why anybody would want to surveil my. Well, I guess they would, wouldn't they? But I guess there are instances where that happens. So.
I mean, there's a reason why we don't have CCTV networks that extend into public bathrooms.
But that's a very extreme example, right? What I'm talking about more is not so much that. It's more, why do I care if somebody knows what my travel data is?
Well, we come back to William Gibson. The street finds its own uses for things, and how can this technology be used to hurt people? So, if we are creating a society in which anybody can be tracked, presumably we would want that information to be very carefully held and only used for purposes that are in the benefit of society. But you could use tracking information to hurt people. For example, one of the big concerns with things like device trackers, like Apple AirTags, is that they can be used by stalkers to do digital surveillance on their targets.
Okay.
It's really handy to be able to find your keys when you've lost them. but it's also really handy to drop an AirTag into the car of someone that you're stalking so you can track them around town, or install software on their phone so you can track them around town. This technology does have legitimate uses, but it could be used to hurt people. And it is incumbent upon us, as people implementing this technology across our society, to think about how that technology could be used and to mitigate against harms. So there are plenty of things that we do that are legal, that we would still nevertheless not want people to surveil.
Yeah.
So
we were talking earlier about, somebody who chooses to have a relationship outside of their marriage, for
Sure.
example. That's not illegal. It might be morally questionable, whatever.
Sure,
But
it's
not
ethically
illegal.
dubious, absolutely.
Yeah.
But should the government be able to track you to your lover's house and then contact your wife and provide them with that evidence? Is that a society that we would like to live in? And what happens when the government starts to become oppressive?
Well, this is the thing. Well, this brings in that whole social credit thing, right?
Yeah,
I mean,
and
essentially,
yeah,
social credit is driven partially by surveillance.
entirely by surveillance and making decisions based on that surveillance. And it would be very easy to turn pervasive surveillance into an instrument of fascist oppression. And in fact, not to be too overblown about this, but that was the modus operandi of the Stasi in Nazi
Yeah.
Germany. Pervasive surveillance used to identify groups that they wished to oppress and used as an instrument of control. That's the risk that we run by creating a society that is structured around pervasive surveillance. So we really have to be measured in how we are using these tools, because we can't say that it's all bad. It's extremely convenient. The cashless society
Yeah, it is.
exists
Yeah.
because it's convenient. It's really nice to not have to have two cards and just to be able to tap on everything with your phone, or to use your phone for all of your credit purchases. Credit cards are gaining traction over cash. Well, one, because of COVID, where we didn't want to touch anything, and that's really put kind of the nail in the coffin of the use of cash. But also because it's convenient.
There is a backlash, though, interestingly. There is a backlash from merchants who are getting very tired of paying fees.
Yeah.
And so I'm noticing more and more small businesses demanding cash or pay ID. So I went to the coffee shop the other day, and they said, "Oh, can you do pay ID?" I'm like, "Really? At a coffee shop?"
Well, I mean, if you're doing a volume business with very low margins,
Yeah,
then
well, I'm not going to pay, whatever the surcharge
you have to pay a
is.
merchant fee.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I mean,
So there is a backlash.
that
against
is
this.
concerning, because what we've done is created a system where we are mediating the basic elements of the economy, being able to pay for things, through private sector platforms.
Yeah.
Whereas
That's a concern.
cash was A, completely anonymous, and B, didn't have a transaction cost on it. But the reason we're doing it is not because certainly COVID moved things along, but it was gaining traction because it was convenient.
It's a hassle factor.
Yeah.
Question, right? It's taking away the pain point of getting. You can't even get cash anymore, really.
It's becoming increasingly
it's
difficult.
really difficult. Like in where I live, I don't know if you noticed, but we don't have an ATM anymore. They're not there. So even if you wanted to get cash out, you couldn't. But I go back to this surveillance question, because I think that your point earlier about oppression is the concerning thing, because we live in a wonderfully stable democracy here in Australia, and we're very conscious about these things, and I would hope we never end up in a place where where all of these tools are used for evil. But you can't necessarily trust government to not misuse these sorts of tools.
I mean, one of the factors of government is that governments change and evolve over time. And ideally, they're evolving for the better, but we can see from all of recorded history that that is not always the case. So you need to be thinking about what happens to your technology when attitudes change and when objectives change. So that is a concern with not just the cashless society, but other elements of surveillance as well. social media, programmatic advertising is heavily based on surveillance, whereby you have advertising platforms that move across different websites. So if you
But
decide
we're choosing to do that, though. We are choosing to put our information on the internet. We are choosing to post things on Facebook. We're choosing to post things on whatever.
are we choosing? Because how do you exist in this society without using email?
Well, no one asks you to post anything on Facebook.
Nobody
Or
asks you,
TikTok.
but no. That look,
Or
you
anything
are
else.
absolutely making a choice to engage in social media. I'm not saying that you're not, but also we've constructed society in such a way now that living off the grid would be very, very difficult. Are you saying that you can't use the internet at all? If you want to have some sense of privacy, you shouldn't use the internet?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying we're choosing to use it. There's using the internet and using the internet.
And what I'm saying is that's not a real choice. Because we've made connectivity a foundational structure of the way that we
But
run
I'm
our
not
society.
arguing against connectivity. I'm arguing against the depth of use of media. You don't have to go and post your holiday on Google or send an email about it necessarily. You don't need to post your food that you're eating for lunch on Facebook and say, look at this wonderful steak I'm eating.
Sure, but we're trying
Yeah.
to live in a society here, and part of that is communicating with other people. And sure, we could go back to writing handwritten, beautifully calligraphed letters and sending them via messenger pigeon, but I think you know that that's not a realistic possibility.
Somebody did send me a letter the other day, beautifully handwritten,
Did like a snowy owl fly in through the window and deliver it to you?
No. But hey, I enjoyed it better than getting an email, I'm going to say. We'll have to end soon. Fascinating conversation, and actually really interesting to sort of have it, because I don't think we really ever have an opportunity to sit down and talk like this.
No, we usually end up mediating
Child disputes or whatever.
well,
Yeah.
yes, disputes between children, or getting involved in long, drawn-out conversations about Indian politics with
Oh,
our father.
God. Yeah. Anyway, let's not go there today. So you're obviously observing this whole space, right? What are 3 things in this country we need to do on information governance and sort of data security that protects us, or at least gives us an edge, in this world?
I will try to broaden out from what the usual answers to this question would be. What you have to protect, and what you don't have, you cannot lose. So at every point of the data lifecycle, think about whether you need this data. Do we need to collect this information in the first place? Do we need to create this information in the first place? Because one of the things about machine learning is we can conduct analytics and create a lot of data about people through things like, say, transaction analysis. Do we need this at all? Do we need to keep it right now? Can we get rid of it? Minimizing the amount of data you hold is going to minimize your risk in the long run. It's also going to save you money, which is a happy byproduct. 2, I think we really need to get to grips with the issue of political information when it comes to the interaction of politics and generative AI. How are we going to learn how to distinguish truth from fiction, and how are we going to make it easy for our community to do that? And 3 comes down to a topic we haven't gone into a huge amount, but automated decision making. We talked a lot about generative AI. We didn't really talk a lot about things like using systems to make decisions based on data that we've received. So this is where we get into the areas of automated bias, or making incorrect automated decisions that happen at velocity that then take a lot of time to unpick. These technologies are easy to implement. They're also easy to implement badly. So one of the things we have to do, particularly in the government space, is ensure that we've got checks and balances when we use these kinds of technologies to make decisions, because we are going to. It is the way that technology is being adopted and adapted now, and it makes sense for us to do it. We just have to make sure that we are using those tools correctly and using them safely. So how are we putting in structures in place to make sure that we use automated decision making as a technology platform correctly, safely, and to achieve better results for the community and not just cheaper results for organizations? Those would be my 3.
Wow. Well, there's a lot to process there and a lot to think about. Tim de Sousa, thanks so much for being part of Smarter Cities.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.